Hello, my name is Sophie, and this video will be discussing whether navigation is a higher form of animal cognition. Here's how this presentation will be broken down. It's broken down into 7 sections, starting with what is animal navigation and cognition, like the overview of that, and then I'll separate it out into 4 different examples, some of which that agree with the original statement, some of which disagree, and then finally there'll be concluding remarks on where I stand on everything. First off, what is animal navigation? Well, navigation is simply getting from point A to point B, and for animals it's important that they do this efficiently because often they're in search of food, mates or shelter. Us as humans, when we get lost or need to navigate, we can use like GPS or maps like just on our phone, but animals don't have that, so they often need many mechanisms which involve cognitive abilities in order to get to places. When it comes to animal cognition, there's a few different definitions. For example, Winner and Adele say cognition is the full richness and complexity of animal behaviour. But what makes something a more complex form of cognition? In terms of navigation, at least, Winner et al. In 2011 suggests there's 4 different levels of complexity as shown in their navigational toolbox. Level 1 includes the sensory motor toolbox. Level 2 is spatial primitives. Level 3 is spatial conducts. And level 4 is spatial symbols, which is uniquely human. As the levels increase, the perceived navigational complexity also increases due to the fact that the animal becomes more and more detached from its environment. So as I go through the next couple of examples, I'll relate back to this toolbox and determine where they sit on the scale to show how complex the navigational mechanism is. The first example of animal navigation I'll be looking into is navigating with landmarks and beacons. A beacon is known as a local cue, whereas a landmark is known as a global cue. This essentially means that a beacon is an object by an animal's destination that the animal aims towards. So this could be a tree near a badger's set, whereas a landmark is an object or a feature of land that an animal can use to tell where they are, but not necessarily something that they aim towards. So this could be a mountain range for a migrating bird. There are many examples of animals using landmarks and beacons, including wasps, bees, birds like the chickadee and the pigeon, but I will be delving into an example with ants. Lemon et al. In 2002 wanted to see whether this species of ant was taken by detours so that the provided landmark was being kept on their preferred side, or whether they were using the landmark as a beacon. To do this, they took 5 different ant colonies, each containing a single queen, 150 to 300 workers, and 100 to 200 brood items like eggs and larvae. These colonies were then placed into 2 different experiments, each containing the same conditions, like for example, the lighting was kept in the centre above for both to try and prevent any shadows. The only difference between the 2 setups was where the landmark started and where the landmark got moved. This image on the screen now shows how the setup of the first experiment and the second looked. As you can see in the first experiment, the landmark moved from the left to the middle, and in the second, the landmark moved from the right to the left. The new nest was made more desirable by making it moist and darker. The paths of ants were only traced for ants that were carrying brood items or other nestmates, as ants without could not be assumed to actually be participating in the emigration. They also stopped tracking ants after they went backwards more than 3 squares to avoid wasting time watching lost ants. 25 complete journeys were measured before and 25 complete journeys were measured after the landmarks were moved. It's also important to mention that the sheep beneath them was changed along when the landmark was changed to remove any scent trails that the ants may have left. McLean and Company's results suggest that the ants were using landmarks in order to navigate. As can be seen in these 2 images here, the ants tend to veer towards the landmarks, both before and after they were moved, instead of just adjusting their path to have the landmark on their preferred side. However, they cannot be 100% certain that all visual cues were taken away, so this could mean that the ants were using other visual cues in order to navigate as well. Additionally, they also can't be certain that all pheromonial cues were taken away, as after they removed the sheet and put a new one in, for 15 minutes the ants were lost and confused, so they think that these ants were then making pheromonal cues to the new nest once they eventually found it, and then were then potentially using the landmark from then on. But because they weren't recording lost ants' paths, it doesn't show up in these images. The use of landmarks and beacons falls under Level 2 of Marina Tao's toolbox. This is because landmarks don't contain any positional information, but they can be used by an animal in order to calculate distance and angle from that landmark to their home. This would then suggest that it requires a higher form of cognition in comparison to just sensory and motor cues. An interesting point of note is that Wynne and Udell class the use of beacons and landmarks as two different levels of complexity, despite them being in the same level in this toolbox. They argue that because an animal becomes to associate a beacon with their home in a similar way to classical conditioning, it isn't all that dissimilar to an animal navigating to a home that it can directly sense. Path integration, also known as dead reckoning, is a method of animal navigation that involves the internal calculation of both the distance and the angle of its way back home based on its outward journey. Path integration is especially useful for animals that have to travel through dark tunnels, like many rodent species, or for animals that have to forage over vast areas, like many bees and ants. The simplest way to tell whether an animal actually uses path integration is to move that animal while it's travelling back home to an unfamiliar environment. Then, once you release it, if that animal then travels in a straight line at the correct distance and angle that it would if it was travelling back to its original home, and then it doesn't account for any passive displacement, it can be assumed that the animal uses path integration. Taki et al. Decided to do a similar test with this species of dung beetle. They are known to dig burrows near piles of dung, where they then take several trips back and forth, collecting all the dung and bring it back to their burrow using their hind legs. Their outward journey tends to be all wobbly as they go and search for the dung pile, but their inward journey tends to be a straight line from the dung to the burrow. So these guys wanted to see whether they use path integration. So they took 5 to 10 individuals and placed them in a flat, sandy experimental area. They then placed randomly dispersed petri dishes, each containing like fresh dung pellets on them. Because of the dung being there, the dung beetles then decided to burrow, which then meant that the experimenters could move the dung to be 125 centimeters from each of the burrows. So that meant that the beetles all had the same distance to travel. On the 7th run that the dung beetle made to the petri dish, the beetle on the petri dish with the dung on it would disperse 50 centimeters, either left or right of the burrow, or towards or away from the burrow. They were given 6 foraging runs beforehand to make sure that they could accurately navigate to and from the burrow. Before the beetles were released from the dish, their burrows were covered with sand and the ground was brushed to remove any olfactory cues. After their release as well, they were recorded for 4 minutes, so if they couldn't find it in 4 minutes, the recording just stopped. They found that after the beetles were displaced, they went in search of their burrow using the same angle and distance they would have needed before the displacement, suggesting that they use path integration. It also suggests that they don't use landmarks, as after they were displaced, they didn't use a landmark to steer towards. Although, to be fair, dung beetles aren't likely to just be randomly displaced in the wild like in this experiment, so it might be the reason why they don't use landmarks. Path integration is quite funny when it comes to this toolbox, as it can sit in both level 2 and level 3. In the case of the dung beetle, it probably sits in level 2 due to the fact that they didn't use landmarks with the path integration. When path integration is combined with landmark information, it can be seen as a level 3 process, as because if the animal was to get displaced randomly, or if they were in a new environment, they could use the landmark information with computed distances and directions in order to take a position fix. Animals can also navigate with sensory and motor cues, which they use to gain information for locomotion, but for also other behaviours such as predator avoidance and social interactions. These cues can include vision, sound, temperature, as well as the Earth's magnetic field. For example, in the past 2 previous examples, the ants have been known to use olfactory as well as their landmarks, and the dung beetles are known to use the Earth's magnetic field and the night sky in order to navigate alongside their path integration. Salmon are another animal that use sensory and motor cues in order to navigate. They are known to take part in a process known as natal homing, which involves the migration from the ocean back to their natal spawning point, which is usually a freshwater stream or river. There are several theories on how salmon are able to do such a long migration, the top 2 being magnetic fields and olfaction. Lohmann et al. In 2008 suggests that salmon imprint on the magnetic field of where their natal site was, which they can then use as adults to find. However, Putman et al. In 2014 suggests that salmon have an inherited magnetic map within them. They determine this by taking salmon from hatcheries, like juvenile salmon in hatcheries, and putting a magnetic coil near them with the magnetic field that was where they would be in the ocean. And they found that these salmon were pointing towards the coil in the way that they would if they were migrating. They then used this to suggest that these salmon have a inherited magnetic map, because these salmon had never migrated before, nor had they even ever left the hatchery. They also think that this is probably a highly adaptive method of navigation, because the salmon only ever do this migration to the ocean once, without the help of experienced migrants. So it would be useful to have an inherited magnetic map in order to navigate. They also think that this map can then be used as building blocks for the adult's journey back to their natal site. Olfaction is thought to be used by salmon as they get close to their natal site. There's two hypotheses of how this might happen. The first being that the juvenile salmon imprint on the odours of their natal site for what they can then use as adults, and that's called the olfaction imprinting hypothesis. And the second is that adult salmon can detect pheromones released by conspecifics of their natal site, and they can use that to navigate towards the natal site. Although Bett and Hitch in 2015 came up with a new hypothesis called the hierarchical navigation hypothesis. It suggests that there's a hierarchy in which the salmon responds to like odors and stuff. So the first response is imprinted odors, and then the second would be the conspecific, and that's especially useful for lost adults that might not be able to find the imprinted scent. And then the third is non-olfactory cues like environmental factors like substrate, and that can be useful for adults that are completely lost, but they'll still be able to find a place that will produce like a high quality spawning area. In the navigational toolbox, the sensory motor cues fall under level 1, making it the simplest navigational method. This is because these cues can provide information to the animal of where something might be in the directions to it, but it doesn't have it encoded within them, therefore it's not spatial. It is also important to note, though, that most of these salmon experiments are done in salmon that are captive. Cognitive map was first proposed by Tolman in 1948 as a way to explain navigational behaviours shown in rats within lab experiments. Since then, there's been a lot of debate of which animals might also have this cognitive map, including chimps, bats, sea turtles, frogs, and humans. These maps are supposedly allowing an animal to create a single coordinate system in their brain for multiple locations, which they can then use to draw like shortcuts to points within the area. There are a lot of mixed opinions on whether the cognitive map is a real thing, but I'll be focusing on the debate on whether honeybees have a cognitive map or not. Here's a diagram made by Dane in 2023 which shows the cognitive map debate and how insects got involved. Gould in 1986 first proposed that the honeybee had a cognitive map. They determined this with a series of experiments where they basically trained a honeybee to fly from a hive to site A where there was food. And then they took, after a while that they got used to that, they took these honeybees in like a dark container and took them to site B, which also had food source, but you couldn't see any landmarks from site B that would have been at site A. Because the honeybees didn't go in a straight line to where they thought they would have ended up if they were at site A, they determined that they weren't using path integration. They also determined they didn't know any landmarks on site B, as they didn't travel directly to the hive from site B, but instead they directly travelled from site B to site A in a straight line, suggesting that they had a true map. However, Weiner and Menzel in 1990 conducted a similar experiment to Gould, but they weren't able to replicate the results, so they came to the conclusion that honeybees did not have a cognitive map. Since the original debate, there's been even more research into whether honeybees possess a cognitive map. Weiner and Menzel now form opposing views. Menzel now has the belief that honeybees might possess a cognitive map, suggesting that the use of new technology that can track bees has helped with this, because determining the bearing of a bee as they move quite quickly is quite difficult. Cruz and Weiner in 2011, however, produced NaviNet. It's a toolbox that they use to suggest that honeybees don't possess a cognitive map, but instead use a decentralized model system. Menzel, however, don't believe that this NaviNet was useful to compare, as it was built upon research with ants. Cognitive mapping falls under level 3 of the toolbox, making it the most cognitively complex navigational method that a non-human animal can do. This is because several locations are encoded within the brain at set distances and angles with the incorporation of relational information. Based on all the examples I've gone through, it seems that there are some aspects of navigation that require higher forms of cognition, especially those under level 3 of the toolbox. The creators of the toolbox suggest that the higher, more complex forms of navigation are likely based on the lower, more simple forms of navigation. Additionally, they think that as the levels increase, the more likely that they were recently evolved. So like, for example, the level for the uniquely human spatial symbols likely came around during the time of linguistic communication and tool use in early humans. And even more recently, things like GPS were only created this century. As this toolbox provides common ground between all taxa, it has the potential to be used to look at the evolution of navigation and the cognitive mechanisms behind that further. I hope you enjoyed. The next few slides will just be the references that were used throughout.